with the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I think more than 300 registrants on the various platforms about neuroethics, a field that I have started, as you said, and love, and to kick off your series in bioethics. And I also wish to thank Dr. Wang for providing commentary on this presentation today. So I'm going to just take a moment to share my screen. And I'm going to ask Professor Yin to give me actually a verbal thumbs up because I can't see anybody anymore.
Oh, which one?
Is it okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
All right, very good. So really, I want to thank all of you in China, at Fudan University, around Shanghai, and around your beautiful country for inviting me to be with you. I am in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and as you can probably see from the glare on my face, the sun is setting here on the West Coast while it has risen for you in China. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today and to have your time in discussing an agenda for neuroethics. And we'll focus on expecting the unexpected. My metaphor for this lecture today, for this speech today, are some of the artwork of Juan Miró, the Spanish sculptor and painter, of which you see one example here. And for me, Juan Miró's paintings and sculptures always have something unexpected in them. Everyone sees something different in them. And each time I look at the painting, no matter how many times, I expect to find something unexpected, and so I do. And so I use these paintings as a theme to connect our discussion today. And indeed, I look forward to speaking for about 45 minutes, to hearing Dr. Wang's comments, and then also to engage in an interactive and I hope lively discussion with you about your interests and curiosities in neuroethics. Let me acknowledge my team at Neuroethics Canada at University of British Columbia. We are about 30 people in total across 2 sites. On the right here is a picture you see of about 1/3 of our group trying to be normal during these COVID times. I would also like to especially acknowledge Anna Nectarline, who helped me extensively with the slides you'll be seeing today. Of course, I always want to acknowledge with enormous gratitude those who support us, and I have no financial disclosures to report. It is customary in Canada to acknowledge the lands on which we play and thrive and work, and here the University of British Columbia is located on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations people. And to them, I and my center owe a debt of gratitude for enabling us to do the work that we do, and hopefully for having an impact, a world impact in health and neurologic care and mental health and well-being for all of us. So here's the agenda for the next little bit of time. We have a new image of Juan Miró. I'll let you take a moment to enjoy it and explore it for yourself while I set the agenda. And first, we'll talk a little bit about neuroethics writ large. Then what I'd like to do is use neuroimaging as a case study, both functional neuroimaging in the case of disorders of consciousness, and then neuroanatomical imaging in the case of unexpected findings as examples of neuroethical inquiry where we took on a difficult challenge. We provided some empirical inquiry and some frameworks in a very solution-oriented way. And then we'll conclude with some forward-looking ideas about where neuroethics may be going in the future, and some of the importance of interacting with the public through outreach activities and our students, of course. So why in 2006 did Nature publish an article that was called Neuroethics Needed? In 2001, about 100 people in the United States came together in San Francisco in a meeting hosted by Stanford University and the University of California, San Francisco, to formalize the field of neuroethics. 5 years later, Nature publishes Neuroethics Needed. It was an indication of the future hope and sustainability for the field that we envisioned in 2001. So what are the first principles for this field? The first principle, in fact, is to align discoveries about the brain with the changes they are bringing to individuals, communities, and societies. And I'll give you examples of all of this as we go on. And so why neuroethics? Why neuro? Why is it special from more traditional bioethical inquiry? And I think a good answer was offered by former President Donald Kennedy in a lecture that he gave at the Society for Neuroscience in 2003, when he said, "Far more than our genomes, our brains are us. They define us as humans. They individually mark out the special character of who we are, our individual capacities, our emotions, and our convictions." And truth be told, we could not say that of any other organ of our body, not our knees, not the musculoskeletal system, not our visceral organs. We can only say and give this special status to the brain. And therein lies the exceptionalism of neuroethics as a field, which really is a bridge between neuroscience and bioethics in the most profound sense. So in 2001, we really defined 4 pillars for neuroethics. And they were the following, as you see here on my screen: the brain and the self. So what does the neurobiology of consciousness tell us? What does the neurobiology of being tell us about who we are as people and our conscious self? The second pillar, holding up this weighty chair, is brain and clinical practice. What do new discoveries in neuroscience tell us about the burden of neurologic and mental health disease around the world? And how can we best offer responsible, ethical, translational methods to the clinical space in patient and physician encounters, in technology, and even as people who are suffering from brain and mental health disorders organize themselves and interact within a broad society. Brain in the wild, this is my interpretation of brain out in law and in the innovation R&D sector. What can the neurobiology and what can neuroscience tell us about criminal justice, guilt and innocence? And what does responsible innovation in neuroscience really mean? And that's really what I situate in the category of brain in the wild. And finally, how do we teach neuroscience to our students, to each other? How do we bring neuroethics into this story? How do we provide responsible and exciting and passionate education and outreach for each other and for the society and public at large? So the 4 pillars of neuroethics: brain in the self, brain in clinical practice, brain in the wild, and then brain in education and outreach. We have a lot to draw upon in terms of the history of ethics and neuroscience. And much of it, sadly, is a dark history. Many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the 19th and 20th century prefrontal lobotomies that were conducted in really without any scientific rigor whatsoever, ostensibly to treat the mentally ill patients, many of whom were women, many with major depression. And this was at a time when, at least in the United States and more broadly in North America, mental health institutions were full to the brim. And the idea was to find a therapeutic intervention that could possibly mitigate the profound effects of depression. Most of you, of course, know that the way in these lobotomies were conducted was unscientific at best. We follow in the heinous crimes committed against humanity in the 1940s by physicians and neurologists, psychiatrists, and others during the Second World War. These individuals were prosecuted during the Nuremberg trials that followed World War II and indicted for their crimes against humanity. In the 1970s, in the United States, a very famous experiment was conducted called the Tuskegee syphilis studies. These were studies that were designed to follow the natural history of syphilis, so an encephalitis created by a sexually transmitted disease, in particular in a large population of poor Black men in Alabama in the United States. The tragedy there was that penicillin was developed during the course of this study, yet these individuals were not given the benefit of the treatment, favoring the experiment to run its course. Of course, that is not something we would ever like to see happen today in our modern world. Following 1970, though, the world, at least the ethical world of neuroscience, gets much better. We see the creation of research guidelines in the United States and Canada. The Society for Neuroscience, the biggest body of professionals in neuroscience, actually creates a social issues roundtable that's devoted to ethical issues. UNESCO creates a bioethics committee with a specialization of the committee focusing on neuroscience developments. Here's the 2001-2002 meeting that I've spoken about before. We formed the International Neuroethics Society in 2006. And under President Obama, so 2 presidents ago, there was even a creation of a special commission for the study of bioethical issues that published many valuable and thoughtful treatises on neuroethical content, some of which we'll talk about today. So a long history, well, a relatively long history, I would say, some that is dark, but that also reflects an evolution in time with awareness in our governments and within our professional organization about what the conduct of good neuroscience means and the respect for human values throughout the process. So whereas we build on history and we've mapped the history, we also build on modern ethics frameworks. And this is, imagine a clock with 9 o'clock at the left and 3 o'clock at the right. And we're going to go from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock all the way around. And neuroethics really builds on modern ethics frameworks in terms of how we think about relationships. Feminist ethics, for example, relationalism. We draw very heavily upon principalism, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and respect for persons or autonomy. We think a lot about utilitarianism and what are the best outcomes for the greatest number of people. This has been a profound framework as all of us have lived through COVID in the past 2 years, and so many decisions had to be made based on an equation of outcomes. The greatest good for the most number of people, or a favoring of individual rights, for example. And that brings us to a focus on deontology, that is individual rights, communitarianism, which focuses on the social order of groups over individuals. And then, well, my favorite is pragmatism, which is really a science-based philosophy of looking at the world, and it informs neuroethics quite profoundly, particularly those of us who are involved in empirical ethical inquiry, and our efforts to deliver proactive, solution-oriented experiments and deliver evidence that at least complements, if not supersedes, for example, moral theory. If we were all together now, I would stop and ask for questions, but I'm not going to do that in this large group on an online format, and I'm going to carry on. But I hope that you are marking down the questions and comments that you have so that we can address them at the end.
You can ask questions. You can ask questions, Judy. You can ask questions. Go ahead.
Oh, so I'm hoping that people put questions in the Q&A in the chat.
Okay.
And we'll go on and then we'll address them at the end.
Sure.
I think it'll be perhaps a little too challenging on my end to to jump in now with questions and comments in the chat that are coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go on. Let me give you some, like a vast array of examples of neuroethics studies that are going on today. And this is just an example or some examples of my group and my colleagues at UBC. And there are 12 or so shown here, 10 or so shown here. Imagine how many more there are around the world. We are working on understanding invasive and non-invasive techniques and decision-making for pediatric epilepsy, both invasive and non-invasive interventions, as well as for opioid addiction. We're working very hard on understanding cultural meanings of brain and mind and how to integrate indigenous methods into our work. We are studying the way that patents in neuroscience are being filed today, as well as intellectual property protections, and how they integrate with an open science movement. And I would love to hear from all of you whether there's an open science movement in China today and how that is evolving. And we are also, since neuroethics also considers the entire spectrum of the central nervous system, what are the priorities and values for advances in spinal cord injury repair? Other projects that we have going on have to do with pain in youth, particularly the communication of pain medication post-operatively, the social co-creation of robotic devices, assistive technologies, and support, social media support in particular for individuals with dementia. And these three are being led by Dr. Robillard at the University of British Columbia. And Dr. Patrick McDonald, who's also faculty in our group, is interested in conflicts of interest in neurosurgery, COVID protections for physicians and patients in the operating room, particularly those patients undergoing neurosurgical procedures, and decision-making for consent for novel interventions for hydrocephalus. So just a thin cut of the tremendous amount of work that's being conducted today in neuroethics. So with that preamble, let's go on to some specific examples. And we'll start with neuroimaging as a case study in the context of disorders of consciousness. So who are we as people? Can our thoughts really be read with, I don't know, machines or EEGs or electrodes or functional MRI? Clearly that question has caught the attention of the media. And it's no surprise because advanced technology is giving us a better understanding of the spectrum of consciousness every day. And here on this graph that was published by Loris et al. In 2009, you see awareness on the y-axis by arousal on the x-axis. And I hope that you are all still here with me at the top of the graph in the top right corner in a state of conscious wakefulness, attending to what I'm saying, thinking about your questions and comments. But of course, after brain injury, we know very well that people may fall into a minimally conscious state. I'm trying to show you with my arrow, or even more profoundly, a vegetative state. And these along this axis show really different levels of arousal, where coma is the worst and is mimicked by general anesthesia, for example. And then we see, deep sleep and light sleep, and hopefully no drowsiness here. Locked-in syndrome is a very special state. But here, this MCS and vegetative state are the areas of interest that I'd like to focus in on now. And we're talking about really two ways of detecting signals of conscious awareness in individuals for whom clinical exam does not reveal any consciousness. And so using functional magnetic resonance imaging, which gives us levels of oxygenation and blood flow to specific regions of the brain when an individual in a seemingly unconscious state is being offered different kinds of stimuli. And we see here, for example, activations in an unconscious individual, presumably in a vegetative state, compared to a conscious individual, and both are attending to stimuli in the external environment. we would have predicted if the person was fully unconscious, there would be no signal here. And yet the parallelism is striking. EEGs or electroencephalography, especially high density EEGs like we see here, also can give us signals of consciousness using electrical signals from the scalp rather than blood oxygenation signals from deep inside the brain. Are these signals of consciousness? Are these signals of reflexive attention to external stimuli? I think the jury is still out, although the evidence suggests that in certain individuals, about 17 to 20%, there really is at least some level of conscious awareness that could not be detected previously without this technology. And we're talking about very real people after very real accidents. So Mr. Scott Routley, for example, suffered a traumatic brain injury in 1999 at the age of 26. He was in a persistent vegetative state. His parents were convinced that he was communicating, but he signaled that he was not in pain using functional magnetic resonance imaging. Leonard Rodriguez had a heart attack in 2010. He also was diagnosed as vegetative, but EEG suggested the possibility that he was actually understanding something in his environment. What's expected here is that when we develop a technology in a good hypothesis-driven way, there should be some positive result, right? Because we aren't just creating research out of the blue. And so the ethical stance is that these patients are in some state between full consciousness and complete absence of activity. The ethical challenge, though, the neuroethical challenge, however, is that legally and ethically and medically, we don't know what to do with these individuals, because we don't know to what extent they're conscious, or how to use their brain messaging in a constructive way that is beneficial to them, their families, and society. We conducted a long series of studies with experts and all kinds of stakeholders around the world in a series of empirical work and national and international consensus meetings. And our question in these studies was, is this research clinically actionable? That is, can we take this laboratory research and try to translate it into the clinical environment? And here in this very complex side, you see there were really two options, and I won't go into all of the nodes, but one is, yes, we should pursue this in a for clinical translation, and no, we shouldn't. And we shouldn't for a number of reasons that might be technical. Again, we're resource limited. We don't know what to do with these individuals. And maybe there's no economical or legal or ethical or social justification. On the no end, another question we asked was, well, if we shouldn't translate it, explain clinically, maybe we should still do it. And then here the nodes are why or why not, and how would research benefit? But perhaps for our purposes is the yes answer to the clinical question. And that is, how would it impact people, both patients and families and institutions? And here you see the many nodes that such results, and I'm just pointing to the many nodes of people and institutions that would be affected, hopefully positively, but perhaps adversely, if this research were clinically actionable. So in defining this, we ask the question, which direction should we go? And with our experts of lawyers, ethicists, physicians, neurosurgeons, neuroimagers, the answer was unequivocally yes. So here we have our work cut out for us in terms of providing neuroethical solutions to a very, very challenging neuroethical problem. And those solutions have to exist on a systems level. That includes understanding what the requirements are for translation, includes understanding the legal context, the resource considerations, how reliable the technology is, what the impact will be on the healthcare system, as well as the impact on the medical team. And the solutions, of course, also involve impact on the patients themselves and their families? What does it mean to have a positive brain signal of consciousness when a person is otherwise unresponsive? How do we use it? Do we use it to signal pain? I think that is an extremely worthy context and one to pursue. Do we use these signals to allow people to change their wills, for example, or to request an advance directive, perhaps an advance directive to die? There, the challenge becomes far more profound, of course, irreversible, and must be considered very deeply as we move ahead with this discourse. So again, if we were together, I would pause and ask for questions, but I am going to move on, and then we'll take everything at once. So I'd like to go on to unexpected findings, and it's really one of the places where neuroethics really made its debut and assured its credibility in the world of neuroscience and biomedicine. So what are we talking about in terms of unexpected findings in this context? We're talking about unexpected findings on structural MRI scans. And these could be unexpected findings typically in patients, not patients, healthy individuals who are participating in a research study as a healthy participant. And yet in probably 1 in every 5 people, there is an anomaly that was unexpected in the brain. One in 5, there's something unexpected, and 1 in 20 where it is clinically significant. So for example, an arteriovenous malformation here, or a meningioma over here. We've been less concerned with individuals who participate in our neuroimaging experiments who perhaps have a cold or are congested from COVID, other than some recent research on long COVID and the impact on the brain. These we don't really treat as clinically significant. The question is, when we find one of these in a person who's supposed to be healthy, how do we manage that in the research setting? So let's ask the question, what's the ethical stance? And it is that discovery and disclosure of an unexpected finding in neuroimaging research, where the finding is unrelated to the purpose of the study, may actually cause more harm than good. And the challenge, the ethical challenge, is if we do pursue discovery and disclosure, we blur the lines between research and clinical medicine. But really, if we detect something on a scan that appears to be clinically significant, could we possibly overlook it? So who's doing the reading? Who would do the disclosing? And how do we follow up? And this has been a question that started within the genetics world in 1999 and has carried over and continues in discourse to date. You see, our methods have been both a deliberative consultation around all these variables here, from actionability to responsibility, as well as empirical research that is establishing the incidence of clinically significant and clinically non-significant findings, and even considering, well, and I'll show you some data around human rights and minors and vulnerable populations. So a rich body of research starting 30 years ago with not only in neuroimaging, but starting as far back as genetics. And so in the neuroimaging space, here is the framework or protocol that myself and colleagues developed for our neuroimaging colleagues. And where we agreed unequivocally was that ignoring incidental findings was no longer appropriate. Given that in young people, an incidental finding on a brain scan is likely to be highly significant, perhaps less significant in older people where 1 in 2 have something anomalous. All research protocols must anticipate incidental findings and deal with them in the consent process, and also in reporting them as part of the protocol when people go for institutional ethics approval. But there are definitely options. And again, in our very pragmatic way, we try to give people options. The options are that the disclosure can be incidental findings will be managed, and then the process for how they'll be managed needs to be disclosed. But there also could be the choice by researchers to not manage incidental findings, and that too must be made clear to participants. And then in each of these cases, participants have been informed transparently about the possibility that there'll be a finding and how they will be managed. And that kind of transparency we feel is vital to the progress of neuroimaging research. And in fact, this protocol in various forms have been adopted now all over the world in virtually all neuroimaging laboratories, to our knowledge, with great satisfaction for those of us in the neuroethics world to have made such an impact in the world. But whereas this might seem pretty straightforward or not to you, for adults, consenting adults, what about children? What about when we have children in neuroimaging studies? Do we disclose to them? Well, in our work, in our empirical work, we have suggested that the disclosure rides heavily on how significant the finding is, whether it's a low clinical significance or a high clinical significance. If it's a high clinical significance, disclosure to the parent is immediately the process to follow, of course. However, if the significance is considered to be low, then we suggested that the capacity of the child to understand the problem at hand and to make a choice alongside the parent is actually very important. And that is what we have put forward again for neuroimagers who conduct research with children, both healthy children and even children with neurodevelopmental disorders who may have varying degrees of capacity to understand what they're participating in and how they would like their medical situation to be handled as it pertains to a research setting. And then, as a third example of incidental findings are the complexities of collectives. So here in North America, we think a lot about respect for persons and individual autonomy as the driving force in what we consider to be ethical research conduct. But what about when it's a community in which a person exists, and it's actually community consent that matters, not individual consent? So who consents for a community and who represents the community? Here in Canada, it might be an elected chief or a band council. There's also hereditary chiefs. It could be the research participants themselves, or it could even be non-research participants who may be affected by the research itself. And all of this complexity must be taken into consideration as we think about incidental findings, not only in neuroimaging, but in all kinds of research in neuroscience that affects collectives. So in Canada, we have a variety of guidance that helps us to understand how to proceed. Our Tri-Council policy focuses on the responsibility of researchers. OCAP is a document prepared by First Nations peoples that speaks to the ownership, control, and access and possession of data and results that are returned from collaborations and co-creation of knowledge and discovery with Indigenous people. And here's some solutions we have, which is really putting the pieces of a puzzle together, but not so much in a linear way, but a far more spiral way than we're accustomed to in conventional biomedical neuroscience research. So we have to expect that Western management strategies do not apply to these communities or may not apply. It's imperative that we as researchers be familiar with regional guidance and regulations. That is our responsibility. It's also essential that we engage in pre-study participatory consultation. That is reminiscent of the phrase that we have, and perhaps some of you have heard it, no research on us without us. So the communities that are in the focus of study must be part of designing the study and suggesting the research questions of importance to them. And finally, the communities must be responsible in co-designing and managing, developing a management plan for the data and the release of results, and really being part of the entire process from the very inception of the study all the way that the results are communicated in the academic world and even to the public. And so I come to the end and want to share with you that this very simple slide, and it's neuroethics in summary. We'll pause for a moment. So excuse me for that interruption. I hope my voice comes back. So what are we doing? We're talking about promoting partnerships between researchers and physicians and scholars. We're looking at integrating the voices of people affected with disorders of the brain and mental health. And we're ensuring the flow of evidence-based information. Very much what we are dedicated to at UBC and in the neuroethics world is engaging the public in conversation. And at UBC, we hold a number of community conversations throughout the world, especially in our COVID world when we can meet online. And we've held conversations about the topics we've just discussed, or even about self-hypnosis for pain, and even more recently about the ethics of medical cannabis for children in an unregulated world. Coming up next week is a very exciting event that we've been holding for ethics for our university, where we've had a 5-part series to really explore how ethics threads through all of our faculties and campuses here in Vancouver and at the Okanagan, which is our partner institution. And coming up just next week is a session on ethics and health, of which neuroethics will be a component. And we will be thrilled if you could join us. It won't be at a good time of day for you, but if you're willing to wake up, we would welcome you as part of the conversation. And so I conclude here. Here's the information to contact me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and return the floor to Professor Yin and Professor Yang for comment. And I'm going to just sip a little bit more water while I do that and regain my voice. I thank you so much for your attention and your engagement and your interest in the topic of neuroethics. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Liz. What was the format of the ethics and health that you just mentioned? It's an online event?
Yes, it's a virtual event. We're going to have 4 panelists.
So it requires registration in advance, right?
Yes, just through our Eventbrite site.
Eventbrite, okay. I will ask the email again regarding the form, the further information regarding the registry, but I probably now wake up at the middle of the night. It's 12 o'clock, right?
Yeah, it's not so late. We've engaged together around the world at 2 and 3 in the morning.
Right.
I will ask if someone from my team has joined us.
Someone from, yes, I see some message.
Perhaps you go. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you, Marianne.
There's the site too.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So our next session, let's welcome Professor Wang Shaoyan from the Institute of Science and Technology for Brain-Inspired Intelligence at Fudan University to comment on today Dr. Ellis' presentation. Professor Wang, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Thanks
very much, Professor Ellis. And it's very intriguing and exciting presentation. Actually, so I know you for a very long time. Barbara gave me this book. Yeah. So
thank you so much.
It's brilliant.
There's a newer volume called Neuroethics Anticipating the Future.
I got that too. I got all of Dr. Ellis' books in my office, which I cannot get access to.
Brilliant. So Yeah, so I totally agree. So neuroethics is needed, and so after 10 of almost 15 years, so the neuroethics is still needed, especially in China. So and regarding the reality in China, so and the neuroethics research is to me is kind of urgent to advance in China because there are several reality issues. One is we know the brain project has taken off in China actually. So in these days, so the programs have been reviewed. So it's a larger program, and it will be more than billion investment. So in this research field, so this is the first ever so large, huge research program in neuroscience in China. So there are lots of research topics covered by this brain project. So for instance, the brain diseases, neurological and psychiatric diseases, neuroimaging, and the big data, and the brain-inspired intelligence. So for such a large program, and the ethics is an essential part to assure the ethical conduction of such research. And because especially it happens all of a sudden in such a next 5 years, so billions investment in neuroscience. And so relevant issue is the industry. So there are lots of investment in industry into such a brain sectors, neuroscience sectors, neurotechnology sectors, for instance, digital medicine for depression and brain stimulation, deep brain stimulator, TMS, so brain computer interface technology. So such technology will tightly related to the brain research, neuroscience research, but they like such ethical regulation to the industry. And I think it's all around the world, and it especially issue in China. And another reality issue is a pandemic. So we are in Shanghai, and we are in the center of a storm. So it's peaceful, but it may not be peaceful in the mind of the human beings. So the pandemic has caused a huge impact to the mental health, to the psychological behaviors and psychological burdens. So the pandemic has profoundly changed the world, and also changed the view, how people see the world. And so it will profoundly change the brain. I think so. There are lots of increase in the mental disease over the last 2-3 years. So such a reality make it the neuroethics is urgent in China. So, and thanks very much for the really brilliant talk. And so to me, so the neuroethics is quite attractive and challenging, because so from one end, the neuroethics will empower the brain research, and so will support the research. Why? To me, the key question is about how to know the unknown underlining the research. For instance, so I'm conducting research in deep brain stimulation. So how early should we provide the brain stimulation for the patients? So let's say for Parkinson's disease, so there are trials on early intervention for Parkinson's disease. And another issue is children. Should we provide brain stimulation for children, for autism, and for dystonia. So I'm working on dystonia, and for such adolescent dystonia, should we provide dystonia? So these questions are unknown. So I think so. I do believe neuroethics provides another door to thinking about, to reasoning these questions, how we move forward. So that's my understanding about neuroethics will empower the brain research, the neuroscience. And but from the other side, so there also a huge effort to bridge the gap between the practice and the theory. And there are lots of ethics research from philosophy. So that's brilliant. But so, and from that end, so I would favor the practice-based neuroethics research. And so such when we conduct such neuroethics research, how should we link the research into the reality, into the research, neuroscientific research people are conducting. So this is very important to bridge the gap between the science and ethics. So that's we can work together to bridge the gap and to empower the brain science. Yes. So there's lots of other interesting topics. For instance, so artificial intelligence and neuroscience. So if we are able to decode the human being, the thinking, the thoughts, and or we are able to program the brain to some extent. So what might be the issue? So are we going to change the structure, change the function of the brain? So it's quite related to the research in brain stimulation, especially in deep brain stimulation. And so when the deep brain stimulation plus artificial intelligence, it provides the potential to program the brain. So how should we deal with these questions? I think it's not only from the scientific research, but also from such ethical research. So this is my thinking to echo to this presentation. Thanks very much. I really enjoy it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Wang. Professor Yin, may I make some comment in response before we go?
Sure. If you would like to, get reply or respond or comment, anything you would like.
Yeah. So thank you. Professor Wang, your comments are what can I say, spot on. It's such a trite expression for something that's so profound. So I think first and foremost, we agree so much that neuroethics or ethical thinking about neuroscience and all that goes on in neuroscience is an empowerment of the science, not an obstacle to the science. And I can't tell you how many times in the early days of neuroethics, our neuroscientist friends and colleagues, and I'm an imager by training. I used to do multi-channel high density EEGs. My colleagues would say, we don't need neuroethics. We're ethical because we do research to benefit humans. And just getting research ethics training is sufficient. And we really had to work so hard to actually show the deeper value of what we were after, not just the good conduct, good professional conduct, which would be virtue ethics, but actually what it means to anticipate potential problems in neuroscience, why that was important, and why that was a good thing, not a bad thing. And I think clearly we've done it, because here we are 20 years later talking about neuroethics to more than 400 people. And we see it all over the world. And so I thank you so much for highlighting that that component of what we're doing, and also that thinking in advance and together, closely aligned, is really the way to proceed, not the neuroscience first and then the ethics after. Because when the ethics comes after, it's too late, right? When we put the ethics right up front, that's where the moment is to really make a good advancement and ensure that everything will be done right, again, from inception to the end, to release the results. So I embrace your comments. And I just want to say that, we haven't at all talked about animal neuroethics. It's not a space that I work in very much, but there are people doing that kind of neuroethical thinking, people who are very interested in research with sentient animals. I believe you can do that research in China. We can't do it here in Canada or the United States, but there are some very interesting and important considerations there that I think we ought to respect and acknowledge in the discourse. And then just finally, I've been doing now for 4 years under funding from the National Institutes of Health, research on deep brain stimulation in children with pediatric epilepsy that's resistant to drugs. And the questions are just incredible because, with every new intervention, we're talking about a first in human trial, because we can't do randomized controlled trials like we could with pharmaceuticals, with drugs. And so do we do this in children? How do we, do we take something developed in a 70-year-old with Parkinson's disease and put it in an 8-year-old whose brain and body is still developing, who could potentially evolve out of their deep epilepsy into something that's more controllable? Do we put something permanent in the brain? Of course, resection is a good option for those who are eligible, but in fact, it's irreversible, right? We've now taken out tissue from the brain. And so these decisions are just so challenging. And I think, you mentioned the case of autism. So my knowledge to date, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that really deep brain stimulation is targeting the motor behavior associated with autism. So the dystonias and the sort of choreiform, aggressive, self-injurious movements, not actually the cognitive or neurodiverse component of the autistic condition. And we have colleagues also in Spain who are working similarly on this problem. I'm sure you are familiar with who they are. So again, very interesting content, very challenging from an ethical point of view. And it's such a privilege to be able to work in this space with all of you and make the kinds of advances we're making quickly and effectively.